All right, so what's the interface between hort and forestry? So there's a bunch of overlaps there. And hort can mean a couple of different things. So, Kendra, tell me kind of what you understand as the different focus areas of horticulture, because each one of them has an overlap with forestry and they're not necessarily the same.
Well, there's a lot, like you said. Like there's landscaping, or there's growing food, or just growing like ornamental plants,
Mhm.
or there's even different kinds of like crops and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
So let's kind of take those in order. So um, if you think of like a typical state or national park, the large majority of it, typically over 95% of the land mass of that park, is going to be um, what feels to most people pretty wild, right? Maybe it's like afforested farms like we have in Southern Illinois, but that looks like forest to a layperson, um, and stuff like that. But for that 5% or 2% or a tenth of a percent that is developed and it's got, mowed lawns and visitor centers and amphitheaters and campgrounds and all of that stuff, boat docks, um, boat ramps, all of that is completely landscaped. People have no idea how much landscape design and landscaping happens in a park. So, for example, um, well, like for this class, if we decide to go to, let's say, Mammoth Cave, it's a couple hours east of here, uh, in near Pig, Kentucky, and when you drive in kind of the main road, Mammoth Cave is about a 6 by 6 mile square, and there's only a couple of ways into the park. It's like real steep, crazy karst, like sinkhole terrain, and so there's only a couple of roads that go in on some of these ridge lines, and it's a really fun and pretty drive because you're driving along and like around every bend there's this little opening in the trees, and you look out across this beautiful rolling landscape and the green rivers right there. It's this bright green river, from the dissolved minerals of the karst, and like you see the rolling hills, maybe like a patchwork of farms here and there and stuff. And that entire road layout was designed for that. That opening in the trees is not natural. It's completely designed and curated, as the millennials like to say, uh, and kind of manicured repeatedly so that what feels like kind of a happenstance experience of driving along and just that like shock of delight you get, like, oh man, that's so beautiful. Let's pull over for a second. We've been driving for 4 hours. Let's stretch our legs. You know, take a photo of the landscape, take a selfie, maybe grab a snack, and then we'll pile back in the car and go on our cave tour. That kind of thing. Those are all over the place at parks. And Skyline Drive in Shenandoah, it's about 70-mile long road running along the spine of the Smoky Mountains, or the Appalachians north of the Smokies. Um, I think there's over 100 of those like waysides and vista and like purposefully created viewpoints, in that 70-mile length. Like it's literally around every bend in the road, but that was on purpose. The entire road was designed from the start that way. Um, but done right, as you know, it doesn't look like it's really landscaped. People go to a park to enjoy the views and stuff like that, but they don't necessarily want to feel like they're in a garden per se at a park. Now, there's also a category for, arboretums and public gardens and stuff. Like St. Louis has gorgeous ones, some really great ones around Chicago, stuff like that. We have an arboretum here in Carbondale. That is kind of supposed to look a little bit less wild, a little bit more mature, uh, design and landscape, and kind of in your face, maybe little, hedgerow fences and stuff like that, saying, be here, don't be standing over here, stuff like that. Um, so once you start to train your eye through some of your like landscape design classes in Hort, and some of your forestry and park management classes, you're going to start seeing this all over the place, where it's a really cool spot, and it was created on purpose. And trails do the same thing. They very purposefully wind you throughout the landscape in a very specific way and to very specific spots and away from other specific spots, for all these reasons. So that's one kind of overlap with horticulture and forestry. The I guess kind of the crop production interface with horticulture is um, in parks at least. Um, there's kind of historic style farming. So on years when we're not quarantined with COVID-19, um, we'll take summer camp out to Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, and they have an 1850 style living farm called the Home Place, and it's a really cool little farm. They legit dismantled a bunch of log cabins and farm structures, split rail fences and stuff, trucked him over to Land Between the Lakes, and built this model farm um, that people actually are working with oxen and using the traditional hand tools and stuff like that, like draw knives and adzes and hoeing rows of different garden crops and stuff like that. Um, and they have to, before they can like get out in the field and hand row hose or hand hoe rows of tobacco because they grow their own pipeweed there. Um, they have to study, like, got to spend some time in the library on site, kind of training up in the historic horticultural practices because they got to be the real thing. They can't like wait till everybody, like all the tourists, leave the working farm for the day and then spray a bunch of glyphosate or something. Um, and so they have chickens running around eating insects instead of spraying insecticides. And every Sunday afternoon, the workers gather for a legit 1850s like salt pork Sunday lunch. And they have lunch like while people are walking through the farm, and you can just watch them doing it and smell the food cooking and stuff. It's the real deal. So there's a space for, this is called living history interpretation, where you don't just kind of ape or pantomime the stuff. You're actually doing it how they used to do things, so that modern day folks can see, what their ancestors did, how we came up, stuff like that. And it's really pretty cool. So there's a lot of like gardening, but also like traditional farming practices that interface with that. Another way that farming interfaces with forestry is, like you said, through agroforestry, where um, particularly in developing nations. So like Groniger and Ruffner have spent a bunch of time, a bunch of trips over to Afghanistan to talk with pretty low resourced, meaning they don't have a bunch of industrial farm equipment, like upper watershed, arid hill farmers, mostly growing tree crops. And there's a forestry component to that, like the physiology of the trees, but there's also the economic and the farming practices component of it, of, how do we best terrace this land, or do we even terrace it, because our slopes are so high that the moment we plant something, that disturbed soil erodes down slope and we just lose all of it forever. And it goes down into our water supply, which is the one water course through this steep walled mountainous valley. So for the students who want to like sign up with the Peace Corps, for example, we always have one or a couple of folks doing that, like recent graduates kind of thing. They'll spend a year or two going to a particular less resourced nation and teaching folks how to do sustainable horticulture, forestry, agriculture, agroforestry, all of the above. The guy that comes to recruit for the Peace Corps the past 2 years spent some time in Micronesia, a whole bunch of like really tiny Pacific island atolls and archipelagos. That's like this group, and the whole population's, I don't know, several tens of thousands, a couple 100,000 people, something like that. Like, it's a tiny group of folks, but the total territory is over 1 million square miles in the Pacific. And he talks about how one of the projects of the guy previous to him, since that guy had a forestry background, was to, on one of these islands that's slowly getting sort of washed away into the Pacific Ocean, they planted a bunch of mangrove trees, because he knew that mangroves are vital to sequestering sediment with their root structures and holding river deltas and islands in place. And, you know, 10 years later, like the island is still there instead of just retreating and retreating and retreating as it gets washed away. So there's a lot of real and measurable good to be done with combining some forestry and horticulture practices. Um, what else in terms of overlaps? The principles of landscape design are going to show up over and over in park management for sure. Um, Even down to random little details like how would you design and locate bollards, which are big, heavy, just masses basically, out in front of the visitor center, because in a national park, the visitor center is a federal facility and therefore a target for terrorist attacks like improvised explosive devices, truck bombs. And so when you go to a national park, you'll see all these beautiful like field stones of the native material, um, placed out kind of between the parking lot or the road access and the building itself to keep hundreds or thousands of visitors a day safe, or at least a little bit safer from that kind of an attack. And in some cases, instead of just like field stones, if that's less appropriate or less aesthetic, they'll use planters. And the planters are probably native stone material or color matched concrete, very specifically, using locally generated sand. And what's planted in those is very likely to be, hopefully, if they're doing it right, local wildflowers, local exemplar species, stuff like that, so that people can see an endangered species like growing between their car and the bathroom they're trying to get to, instead of having to go way off, like miles or kilometers into the wilderness to find a natural patch of that endangered species. And oh yeah, we'll also have a nice aesthetic little sign kind of educating folks, just very mildly, this is what this is, and this is why it's so rare, and this is what we're doing to, repatriate it or restore it around here in this particular park. So yeah, most folks, the large majority of recreationists are not seeking like a super burly wilderness, we're out of water, so I got to drink my own pee, Bear Grylls style burly experience. They're looking to enjoy a park. And for a lot of people, that sort of unconsciously is coding for, um, I'd like all the civilization that I'm used to, all the power flush toilets and the AC in the visitor center and clear maps and Wi-Fi these days and all of that, maybe 4G. Um, but I want to feel like, I'm out on a safari or I'm out on an expedition. Like I want to be able to get from this safe and developed and electrified and air conditioned space out into what feels like the wildlands with a couple of minutes of effort. Super quick and easy. And it takes a lot of horticulture and in particular landscape design to accomplish that well without feeling like you're at a theme park. So yeah, tons of overlaps. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.